Hi, God bless you. My name's Luis Carlos Reyes. Most people know me from my videos on YouTube in Spanish. I usually produce videos that deal with apologetics, things of that nature, and occasionally I'll produce a couple of English-speaking videos. But my calling's mostly to deal with the Spanish-speaking community. But in this day, I wanted to make a special video. I wanted to address a Unitarian argument put forth by Sir Anthony Buzzard, who's a Unitarian, well-known Unitarian. And I wanted to deal with some of the things that he said on his video, because I also see it happening a lot in the Spanish community. It's the same argumentation. Often what I see is that a lot of the things that are produced in the English-speaking world are translated into the Spanish world, and I see the same arguments. Most of these arguments, I think, are fallacious. But I want you to hear Sir Anthony Buzzard himself on the video that he produced dealing on John 1:1, okay? And there's several of them, but this is one of the latest ones. So why don't we hear them, so that way we put it into context what I want to talk about, okay? Let's listen to it.
Theosinologos means the word is exactly expressive of God. If you like, God himself, not somebody else, almost as though John is anticipating the chaos of later years. In the beginning was the word, no cap, the word, the plan, the gospel, God's immortality plan to create immortals to live with him forever. That was in the beginning, parallel to Genesis. And the word was with God. It was in his mind. To have something with you means it's your project. You'll find examples of that. To have something with you, it's like it's my baby. It's my concern. God's concern, the thing he delighted in, was his word. And the word was God himself, fully expressive of God. That's what that means. Not another person. So I like the Williams translation there. The word was God himself, not somebody else. You are what you think. As a man thinks, so is he. You are what you say. Out of the abundance of the heart, the man speaks. In Job 26, you'll find a wonderful verse there. What spirit is speaking through you? Whose words are these I'm hearing, Job says in 26 of Job. Whose spirit, whose words? So words and spirit go together. And that marvelous self-expression of God, his logos, then became embodied in a real human being who began in the womb of his mother, precisely because of the miracle worked in Mary. That's where Jesus began, Luke 1:32. Precisely because of the miracle, he'll be Son of God. No other reason. No pre-existing son.
The first thing that I see here is the common notion or presupposition that a human being processes his thoughts in the same manner that an infinite, omnipotent God processes his thoughts. So that's the first assumption that I see here. It's very common. Usually the idea is all like, well, hey, I got 5 fingers, then, maybe God has 5 fingers as well. Well, not to that extreme, but what I'm trying to say is, well, if I process my thoughts in this manner, therefore God should process his thoughts in that manner. So I see a very common assumption here, a presupposition that the manner a finite being processes his thoughts are necessarily the same way an infinite being processes his thoughts. And there's a big problem with this. First of all, we don't even know how we process our own thoughts. I've studied certain areas in linguistics and cognitive psychology, relevance theory, and several other areas. And there's what's called a spreading activation model of memory, where the way we process our thoughts, they think they're linked in a network, and every node receives activation and it diminishes as it goes along. But why is it that we don't retrieve our entire mental encyclopedia when we hear a thought, when we hear a word in a sentence, for example? Relevance theory explains it, and it has a very convincing manner on how to deal with it. Relevance theory is developed by Dan Sperber and Deirdre Wilson in their book Relevance and Cognition. And I'm going to follow up a little bit more on this because there's a lot that relates to what I'm talking about here. But my point is, right now, is that if we don't even know how we process our own thoughts, what on earth is going to tell you that, well, God's thoughts must be processed the same way? That's a huge assumption. That's the first problem I have with that argumentation. The one that says that, well, if my thoughts are just something abstract and inanimate, therefore God's thoughts must be something abstract and inanimate. Now, the other side of the coin is this, that when we apply actual things that we know from cognitive linguistics to God, all of a sudden, well, you don't want to apply it anymore. What am I talking about? Let me give you an example, okay? It's very common to hear from Unitarians, even in the Spanish-speaking world, that the Logos in John 1:1, which says, "En arche in hologos kai hologos in proston theon kai theos in hologos." In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It's very common to hear from Unitarians and Oneness people that the Logos there is the thought in the mind of God, or the plan, the idea that he had forth for the future, for his future son, who the son would be created in the flesh, born of the Virgin Mary. That's very, very common. The assumption here is, I mean, it's honestly it's an ignorant assumption, and I say this with all due respect. It ignores the fact, and now I'm going to apply what we know from human beings to God, because if that's what you guys did at the beginning, then let's be consistent here. Well, in linguistics, there's an idea that let me just put it to you this way. There's the linguistic symbol. That's the word. It could be written or spoken. And the top of this triangle, there's the thought, the concept in your mind of that linguistic symbol. And on the right side, you have the actual ontological referent. So let me give you an example. Let's think of the word tree. T-R-E-E. Tree. That is the linguistic symbol on this side of the triangle. It could be written or spoken. As a matter of fact, it could be in any language. Let's put the word árbol in Spanish. It's a word in Spanish translated. On the top of the triangle here, you have the concept. Now, the concept is not the same thing as the word, as what's written here, as what is linguistically encoded. How do I know that? Because we could switch any word and the concept won't change. And I'll go a little further on that where the concept does change. But I could use árbol, I could use tree, I could use blah. We can call it whatever we want. It's a linguistic convention. So there is no necessary connection between the linguistic symbol and the thought in the mind of the person who is processing that. And there is no necessary connection between the ontological referent. What am I trying to say here? Well, let's look at it this way. If we all close our eyes right now and we picture a tree in our mind, if our brain was to be open, if our skull would be cracked open, we are not going to see a tree in there. The tree's not there. If you open your eyes, the tree is out there. That's the actual ontological referent. There is no connection between the tree, the concept in my mind, and the linguistic symbol. Those three things are distinct. This is very important, super important. Why? Because whatever I'm processing in my head has nothing to do with what's going on out there, because there is no necessary connection. As a matter of fact, I can have an image of in my mind of any type of a tree, and I'm going to explain a little further how those concepts are formed, how they're shaped when we interpret in context. But my main point right now is this: it's a point that is a very important point. There is no necessary connection between the linguistic symbol, the thought in the mind, and the ontological referent. Those three things are distinct. And I'm going to show you something. I'm going to show you why they're distinct, okay? So, if I were to make this comment here, I want to know what you people would think if I were to say this comment here. These are the thoughts in my mind. My thoughts are that I want my son to be a doctor. That is my plan. Okay? So, you guys heard that. You heard I communicated to you linguistically what my plan in my mind is. How many of you will conclude from that comment, from the fact that I have that plan in my mind, that my son currently does not exist? You don't know me. You don't know if I have a son or not. Now, if you really think about it, you don't know if my son exists. He may or may not. In fact, I may not even have a son. I may be planning to have a son, and in the future, I want my son to be a doctor. And in that case, that ontological referent does not exist. However, what if my son was already born and my son did exist and I made that very same comment? In that case, yeah, my son would exist. What's my point? My point is that there is no necessary connection between the concept in the mind and the ontological referent. The fact that you're processing a thought in your mind has zero to do with whether or not that referent exists. This is the way it is. Now, let me give you another example. Let's say I'm going to pretend that I'm you. I'm going to think in my mind that I am you. Am I you? Of course not. I'm not you. I'm me. Well, what I'm trying to show here is that there's no necessary connection between the linguistic symbol, the concept in the mind, and the ontological referent. Now, how about this? How about this? This is the idea in my mind. If you were to hear me make this comment, I really miss my grandmother. That's her. I have sweet memories of her in my mind. I'm going to miss her a lot. How many of you would conclude that my grandmother no longer exists? That she passed away? It would be fallacious to conclude that, because in fact, my grandmother may have just moved to another country or another state. And I'm just saying that I'm going to miss her. What's the point? The point is the fact that I process her concept in my mind has zero to do, nothing to do with whether or not the actual ontological referent exists or not. So let's apply this to John 1:1. The fact that the word, that concept, was in the mind of God, what in the world does that have to do with whether or not the referent of the Logos existed or not? Nothing. Nothing. See, Unitarians begin with the presupposition of the non-existence of the Son prior to showing it. That's the problem with that. This is a linguistic refutation of that argument. It has nothing to do with theology. In reality, it has to do with what we know from linguistics. The fact that the Father, or let's say God, however you want to say it, the fact that God processed a thought in his mind says nothing of whether that reference of that thought existed or not at the moment that thought was processed. This is not anything that's, it should be obvious. It should be very, very obvious. So when oneness proponents or Unitarians say that, well, the Logos was just a thought in the mind of God, it doesn't say just a thought. You're assuming that the Logos has no referent. Now, there are some terms that are referential, some that are partially referential, some that may not even have a referent. You can read Moises Silva's book on biblical words and their meanings. But actually, I recommend for you a book by Robin Carson. It's called Thoughts and Utterances. Now, that book explains very clearly what's an ad hoc concept, how we sometimes produce concepts in our mind for a specific purpose, for a specific reason, and they may have never been used before. Let me give you a real quick example. Okay, if I were to say to you, wow, what a beautiful day. Look at how beautiful the waves are crashing into the beach, and I just love the breeze. Wow, those are such beautiful birds flying over the waves. What kind of birds, what's a conceptual formation that you formed in your mind of birds? How many of you formed vultures or parrots? Not a whole lot, I would assume. Most of you probably formed the conceptual formation of a seagull. Why? Because the contextual information primed the nodes in your mind to select the most relevant information for this particular situation. So in this context, the word bird more specifically refers to a specific type of bird, a seagull. This is the way how we process information in context. We just don't retrieve every encyclopedic entry on bird. Rather, we form it according to the context, and it's always this way. In a context, I'm using it in a very broad sense, as used in relevance theory, but I'm going to go into that a little later. That not today. Anyway, so once again, the fact. Let's apply this because Unitarians are using human concepts to apply it to God. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's use what we know from cognitive linguistics and apply it to John 1:1. Okay. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So the fact that the Word was in the mind of God, yeah, that says zero as to whether the referent of the Word was something or was or was not something animate and existed or not. It doesn't tell you. All you're telling me is that he was in the mind of God. So what? You're in my mind. Does that mean you don't exist? No. I can accept that the Word was in the mind of God. What I can accept is a presupposition that the Word was only in the mind of God. That is what you Unitarians first have to prove, and then present your argument. You don't come here to the text and say, well, I'm assuming his non-pre-existence and say that he was in the mind of God. That means nothing. The fact that he was in the mind of God really means nothing. Why? Because there's no necessary connection between the linguistic symbol, the conceptual formation in the mind, and the ontological referent. And we know that logos can be used as a name for a referent who's a person. We know that from Revelation 19:13. Yeah, you could say it was used at a different point in time, but my point is that it can be used as a linguistic symbol applied to a person. Okay? So what I'm refuting right now is the erroneous idea that merely because a concept is in the mind of God, that from that you deduce that that concept that linguistic symbol logos had no actual ontological referent. That's an absurd argument in reality, and it's an argument from silence. You're assuming the non-existence of the referent of the logos. And also, whatever linguistic symbol is used to describe a referent has no necessary connection with the ontological referent. No. Whether you can you can refer to someone as a thing. For example, let's say I'm in my room and here Osama bin Laden walked in here. Let's say he was still alive. He walks in here and I say, evil has entered this room. Okay, that I refer to him as in an abstract way. I use the linguistic symbol evil. Does that mean that he didn't exist? Does that mean that he's something abstract only in my mind? Of course not. Whatever you describe, however you describe a referent, whether it's abstract in an abstract way, in a personal with a personal with a personal noun, personal name, it has nothing to do with whether he exists or not, and it has nothing to do with his ontology. So the fact that the logos is a word, it refers to as a word, has nothing to do really with the ontology of the referent of the word. So, as a matter of fact, the context makes it so clear that Unitarians are wrong. Why? What is the word? They say it's just a thought in the mind of God. But what does clause 3 say of John 1:1? In the beginning was the word was with God. And what? Kai theos ein ho logos. And the word was what? What does it say? And the word was God. The word was God. God is not a thought. But what does John 1:1 say? In clause 3 specifically. It says, Kai theos ein ho logos. And the word was God. It doesn't say, and the word was epinaios, a thought in the mind of God. It doesn't say, and the word was naima, a mind of God. It doesn't say any of that. I mean, there's Greek words for that. It says, Kai theos ein ho logos, and the word was God. It doesn't say, and the word was a thought in the mind of God. That's a problem. Then that's linguistically explicit. Linguistic information is very explicit. So to go around that is really to completely ignore what the text is saying. So let me recap real quick because I know I'm making this a little too long. Unitarians assume that an infinite being processes his thoughts in the same way finite beings do. So in essence, Unitarians are taking a humanistic approach because they're making man the measure of how God's ontology exists and how he processes his thoughts. We don't even know how we process our thoughts. I mean, I have an idea, you know, I've looked into it, but I'm sure most of you have no idea how we even process our own thoughts. So the gall of human beings to say, well, if I do it this way, then God must do it this way. That's absurd. It really, really is. The second thing I wanted to show is that linguistically, there is no necessary connection between the linguistic meaning, whether it's written or spoken, the conceptual formation formed in the mind, and the ontological referent. There is no necessary connection. So whether the logos is used as an abstract or whether it's used to, however, whatever word you put in there has no connection with who the logos or what the logos is. That's just what we know. And the concept that you form in your mind also has no connection with the ontological referent. Because I can think of a bird that flies over the ocean, and I could think of him as a crow, or I could think of him as a hawk, or I could think of him as a seagull. The context will tell you what conceptual identity was that the author wanted you to form in your mind. In John 1:1, the author makes it so explicit that he even communicates it linguistically. It says the word was a thought? No. The word was a plan in the mind of God? No. The word was God. So what is the word? This is very difficult here. What is the logos? God. That's it. Don't try to go around it. Why look for other texts and say, well, it can't be God. It's telling you the word was God. Well, folks, this is all I have for today. Maybe I'll make some more videos in English, but God bless you guys. Take care.